Hey guys, tonight we drift quietly into a rather shadowy corner of medieval royal life, the private chamber, lit not by electricity of course, but by the glow of candles and the scent of smoldering resin. You might picture it, a king's apartment in a stone castle, thick walls keeping out the cold, guards stationed far below, and high above, behind carved doors, a scene far softer than battlefield or banquet. And don't worry, before you imagine this as scandalous, remember, everything here is more ceremonial than anything else. Because in medieval courts, even bedtime could be a public performance. A king's chamber was as much stage as sanctuary. You probably wouldn't survive one of these nights, if only because trying to fall asleep while 20 tapers drip hot wax near your pillow isn't exactly conducive to rest. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing those. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The chamber is dark at first, but then the servants bring in the light. Not just one candle, but dozens, carefully arranged in tall iron prickets and gilded stands. In some courts, the number of candles was prescribed by etiquette. Too few suggested stinginess. Too many might imply vanity. And wax wasn't cheap. Beeswax candles, the really fancy ones, were a luxury that cost more than a meal for an entire household. A monarch's chamber might glow with 20 or 30 beeswax candles, their flames trembling, the air faintly sweet with hummied smoke. Mainstream fact: in medieval Europe, beeswax candles were prized over tallow candles because they burned more cleanly and smelled pleasant. Their use was often restricted to churches and aristocratic households. Quirky tidbit: some chronicles describe kings who insisted on colored wax, green or red for special nights. Whether this was symbolic or just an early version of mood lighting is anyone's guess. Historians still argue whether these elaborate setups were truly romantic rituals or simply status displays, a way of reminding everyone, even in the most intimate setting, of the king's wealth and power. The candles were never just background light. They were arranged symbolically, one by the bed, one at the prayer desk, another near the basin of water for washing before rest. Sometimes candles were even placed at the threshold to signal to courtiers standing outside that the royal couple had retired. It was like hanging a polite "do not disturb" sign, except made of fire. You imagine lying there with your head on embroidered linen, the shadows dancing on the ceiling, the flicker of gold leaf in the wall paintings shimmering with every draft. The crackle of a log in the hearth mingles with the faint drip of melted wax, and it becomes strangely hypnotic, like watching 1,000 tiny metronomes sway in imperfect harmony. The candles still glow faintly in your imagination as we drift into the next ritual, one that might sound more awkward than intimate. It was called the ceremonial bedding, and it turned the private act of going to bed into something strangely public. Picture this: the king and his new queen, married earlier in the day, or perhaps even the week before, being led in solemn procession to their chamber, not alone, not hand in hand under a moonlit sky, but surrounded by courtiers, bishops, and noble witnesses. It was a parade, but instead of ending at a banquet table or throne, it ended at the foot of a bed. Mainstream fact: in many medieval courts, especially in France and England, newlyweds of royal rank were ceremoniously escorted to their bedchamber. This bedding ceremony was meant to demonstrate the legitimacy of the union and, by extension, any heirs that might follow. Quirky tidbit: some places took it to absurd extremes. In Scotland, there are records of courtiers sitting around the bed, drinking wine while the couple lay under the covers, fully clothed, mind you, before finally retreating at dawn. Nothing says romance like trying to sleep while 20 half-drunk nobles argue over who gets the last goblet. Historians still argue whether these ceremonies were universally dreaded or whether they were seen as simply another duty of monarchy. Was the king embarrassed? Was the queen nervous? Or did both just accept it as part of the crown's heavy pageantry? The sources don't tell us, though judging from later complaints, dreaded might be the safer bet. You can imagine the awkward silence as servants undid the bed curtains, fluffing pillows stuffed with goose down, while bishops murmured prayers over the sheets. The court jester might have slipped in a crude joke or two, trying to lighten the atmosphere, though one suspects the humor landed with about as much grace as wet bread. Joke 1. It's hard enough to fall asleep with your in-laws in the next room. Imagine having the Archbishop of Canterbury personally tucking you in. The ritual wasn't just about awkwardness, though. It carried deep symbolic weight. The public witnessing of the royal couple's retirement was meant to ensure that no one could later claim the marriage had never been consummated. For dynasties constantly haunted by questions of legitimacy, even the bedroom had to be documented, albeit discreetly. And then when everyone had offered their blessings, when the prayers were said and the goblets drained, the courtiers would bow themselves out, the door would close, silence would fall, and only then could the royal couple exhale and perhaps laugh at the absurdity of it all. Quirky tidbit again. In some courts, the bedding included a tradition of throwing stockings at the couple in bed. The first person to hit either the king or queen was said to be the next to marry. Historians have mercifully left us no sketches of the bruises caused by medieval wool socks. Joke 2. Honestly, medieval courtship sounds less like a honeymoon and more like the world's worst sleepover. The bedding ritual was so well established that even foreign ambassadors sometimes attended, reporting home in detailed letters what they saw. Imagine being the poor envoy tasked with writing to your king, "Yes, sire, I witnessed them go to bed. No, sire, I will not provide drawings." Historians still argue whether the ceremony ever crossed the line from symbolic to voyeuristic, but the consensus is that most of the time it ended with the couple simply lying down in full dress. In some cases, they weren't even expected to stay in bed. Once the crowd dispersed, they might get back up, change clothes, and carry on privately. Joke 3. So much for romance. You get escorted to bed like a child, tucked in under state supervision, and then have to pretend to be asleep until the audience leaves. And yet, for all its strangeness, the ritual mattered deeply to kings. It anchored dynasties, it reassured nobles, it whispered to history, this marriage is real, this lineage secure, this bedchamber holy ground. So, as you lie back tonight, you can almost hear the shuffle of velvet slippers, the murmur of prayers, and the soft thud of stockings landing on embroidered sheets. A bizarre ritual, yes, but one that stitched together private desire and public duty in the most peculiar way. Now that the chamber has been lit, and the bedding ritual survived with only mild humiliation, we step into another layer of royal peculiarity, the timing of intimacy, dictated by the stars themselves. It might sound whimsical, but in medieval courts, astrology was not a fringe hobby, it was statecraft. Kings consulted astrologers for wars, coronations, even when to plant their vineyards. So naturally, the heavens also guided what happened under the canopy of the royal bed. Mainstream fact: astrology was woven into medicine and daily life in the Middle Ages. Physicians often checked the alignment of planets before prescribing treatments, and kings did the same for favorable nights to be with their queens, particularly when an heir was desired. You can picture the scene: a royal astrologer hunched over a parchment sky chart, quill tapping at the constellation of Leo or Capricorn, while a nervous steward waited to carry the verdict upstairs. The king might sigh dramatically if Mars was in a cranky mood that week, or nod with relief if Venus promised smooth sailing. Quirky tidbit: one chronicler mentions a French king who refused to visit his queen's chamber unless the moon was waxing. He believed a growing moon would produce a strong, healthy child. Imagine the disappointment when his queen rolled her eyes and said, "Well, perhaps you should ask the moon to change her schedule." Historians still argue whether kings truly believed in the astrological charts or whether it was a polite excuse. After all, the stars are against us might be a more diplomatic way of saying, "I'm too tired tonight." Joke 1. Medieval astrology was basically the royal version of, "Sorry, not tonight, Mercury's in retrograde." But timing was more than planetary excuses. Some kings took the matter so seriously that astrologers were paid handsomely, rivaling physicians in prestige. A king who ignored astrological advice risked being accused of recklessness, especially if a much-hoped-for heir did not arrive. It wasn't just private life, it was dynasty management. In practice, the astrologer's advice shaped rituals. A queen might be told to bathe in lavender on an auspicious evening, or to wear green silk, the color of fertility, while Venus was in ascendancy. Servants prepared special dishes on such nights: almonds, honey cakes, or spiced wine, thought to harmonize the body with the stars. Quirky tidbit again. One English court astrologer reportedly declared Tuesday nights unlucky because Mars presided over them, bringing quarrels. Imagine being the queen, perpetually disappointed on Tuesdays, staring at the ceiling while the king muttered about bad omens. Joke 2. Honestly, the safest way to ruin a mood in medieval times was to announce, "Hold on, I need to check my star chart." The chamber itself reflected these beliefs. You might see tapestries embroidered with zodiac signs or a painted ceiling scattered with stars. It wasn't just decoration, it was celestial reassurance. When the king lay down, he was quite literally beneath the heavens' gaze. Sometimes, though, timing advice created problems. If astrologers declared only 3 nights in a month auspicious, courtiers gossiped if the queen appeared unusually cheerful on the morning after. Servants became amateur astronomers themselves, whispering predictions while polishing goblets or folding linens. Historians debate how far queens embraced these rituals. Some evidence suggests they quietly mocked their husbands' reliance on the stars, playing along while privately rolling their eyes. Others, however, may have found comfort in the rhythm of lunar cycles, seeing them as ancient feminine wisdom dressed in royal robes. Joke 3. Imagine being a medieval queen, and your husband cancels plans because Saturn is giving him side-eye. And so the ritual of timing wasn't about spontaneity, but about choreography. Love, duty, and dynasty moved in step with the cosmos. To lie beneath the royal canopy was to lie also beneath Jupiter, Venus, and the waxing moon, as if the heavens themselves were silent attendants in the chamber. As you drift tonight, picture that odd union: stone castle walls enclosing a soft bed, a flicker of candlelight, and beyond it all, the endless sky, sprinkled with stars that medieval kings swore dictated the fate of their love and of their kingdoms.
The stars may have whispered their verdict, but once the timing was deemed right, another peculiar layer of ritual awaited: the perfumed linens of the royal bed. It sounds almost luxurious, sheets fragrant with roses or saffron, but in the medieval mindset, scented bedding wasn't just a comfort. It was medicine, magic, and courtly theater all at once. Mainstream fact: in the Middle Ages, textiles were often steeped in scented water or strewn with dried herbs. This wasn't merely for pleasure. Medical theory at the time believed that fragrance could balance the body's humors and protect against disease. If a king wished to remain vigorous, he might insist on lavender-scented sheets or rosewater sprinkled across the bedclothes. Imagine attendants bustling in earlier in the evening. They shake out great squares of linen embroidered with gold thread, then sprinkle them with concoctions from tall glass flasks. A steward checks the mixture: rosewater, musk, and perhaps a pinch of saffron ground down to powder the color of sunlight. The air grows heavy, sweet, and slightly dizzying, part apothecary, part garden. Quirky tidbit: there are accounts of beds scented with rosemary, but also with stranger things, like ambergris, a waxy substance from Wales that smelled faintly of the sea. Medieval kings were not above sleeping on sheets that reeked of expensive ocean mystery. You can almost imagine a queen wrinkling her nose politely, whispering, "It smells like the harbor, dear." Historians still argue whether this perfumed bedding was truly meant to encourage romance, or if it was more about health and status. Was the musk an aphrodisiac, or just a way to flaunt exotic imports from far-off lands? Joke 1. Honestly, it's like the medieval version of arguing over which scented candle to burn before bed. Perfumed linens also carried symbolic meaning. Rosewater was linked to love, saffron to wealth, lavender to calm. A king who ordered sheets doused in each was, in a sense, declaring his hopes for affection, for heirs, for a peaceful night untroubled by indigestion. But here's the kicker: all that fragrance attracted pests. Servants frequently had to chase away moths and even mice lured by the sweet-smelling herbs sewn into mattresses. You can imagine a weary chambermaid muttering that the king's saffron-stuffed cushions were less romantic and more like a buffet for rodents. Joke 2. The ultimate mood killer: discovering your love pillow has been chewed on by a mouse with expensive taste. And yet, perfume in the bedchamber was considered so essential that some kings traveled with their own flasks of rosewater, ensuring consistency wherever they went. It became part of their personal aura, the same way they might insist on a favorite goblet or a trusted physician. Quirky tidbit again. A record from an Iberian court mentions sheets rubbed with crushed basil to keep away evil spirits. The poor attendants must have spent hours transforming the bed into a salad. Historians debate whether queens themselves had any say in these choices. Did they request calming lavender before a nerve-wracking bedding ceremony? Or were they at the mercy of whatever recipe the king's apothecary had concocted that week? The chronicles are silent, but one suspects many queens simply endured the fragrance wars. Joke 3. Picture trying to drift off while your bed smells like a spice market exploded under the duvet. And yet, the image lingers. A bedchamber glowing in candlelight, sheets embroidered in silk, an air so thick with perfume you could almost taste it. To medieval eyes, it was the perfect setting for royal affection, or at least for the performance of affection. For us, it's a reminder of how even the smallest details, the smell of a pillow, the sheen of saffron, could carry political and romantic weight. And so, as you settle tonight, imagine yourself drifting into sleep on linens drenched in rosewater, lavender, and perhaps just a hint of whale mystery. Strange, extravagant, impractical, but undeniably peculiar, just as a king's private ritual was always meant to be.
The sheets are fragrant, the stars have given their nod, and the candles still flicker. But not everyone has left the room. Tonight's peculiar detail is perhaps the strangest of all, the silent attendants who lingered in corners of the royal bedchamber. Imagine it. You're a king, robed in silk, stepping into a bed carved of oak and hung with heavy curtains, and in the dim glow of candlelight, you're not alone. A few trusted attendants sit quietly in the shadows, motionless, unspeaking, eyes downcast. They were there not to participate, but to witness, to guard, and perhaps to make sure nothing scandalous occurred. Mainstream fact. In many medieval courts, it was customary for servants or even chamberlains to remain in the room until the king and queen had settled into bed. In some cases, they even slept on pallets at the foot of the royal bed, ready to serve at a moment's notice. Quirky tidbit. In one German court record, it's noted that attendants were so used to sleeping in royal bedchambers that when a king traveled, he complained of insomnia without their familiar presence. Essentially, he needed his sleepover crew nearby, like a child afraid of the dark. Historians still argue whether these attendants were there for security, after all, assassination was always a risk, or whether they were more like witnesses, quietly guaranteeing that royal marriages unfolded according to expectation. Was their role sacred or simply practical? The truth may be a mix of both. Joke 1. Nothing kills romance faster than a butler perched silently in the corner, knitting. The attendants weren't always passive. Some were expected to wake the king at certain hours with whispered reminders, prayers, duties, even midnight doses of wine or medicine. You can almost imagine the queen rolling her eyes as a steward crept forward to murmur, "Sire, time for your digestive syrup," just when things were finally cozy. Quirky tidbit again. In Spain, some royal attendants carried little bells to signal when the royal couple was finally asleep, allowing guards and servants outside to disperse. That must have been the world's strangest lullaby, a faint ting-ting declaring the king had nodded off. Joke 2. Today we use sleep apps. Back then you had a human Fitbit watching you breathe. And yet, for all their awkward presence, these attendants added a layer of reassurance. Imagine the hushed quiet, the shuffle of slippers on stone floors, the muffled clink of goblets being set aside. A king could rest knowing that at least someone was awake, guarding him in that most vulnerable state. Sometimes their role crossed into the bizarre. In certain rituals, attendants touched the bed curtains or even adjusted the pillows as symbolic gestures of blessing. You'd hardly call that glamorous work, but for a servant, it was an honor. The bedchamber was the heart of the dynasty, and being there meant proximity to power. Historians still debate whether queens found comfort in their presence or frustration at the lack of privacy. Some sources hint at queens bribing attendants with coins or favors to step outside for a few blessed minutes of solitude. Joke 3. Picture trying to share a private joke with your spouse while a guard coughs politely in the corner, pretending not to listen. And so, the royal bedchamber was never truly private. Even in its most intimate rituals, silence was filled with the breathing of others, the rustle of fabric, the faint scrape of chairs in shadowed corners. To us, it might sound claustrophobic. To them, it was normal, a guarantee of safety, propriety, and tradition. So, tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine that curious scene. The soft warmth of scented sheets, the hush of flickering candles, and the quiet, steady presence of figures in the corners. Neither threat nor friend, just silent shadows keeping watch over the peculiar world of medieval kings and their queens.
The attendants may have melted into the shadows, but what truly set the mood, or at least attempted to, were the sounds and music drifting through the chamber. Tonight, our focus is on the ritual of soft songs and strange noises believed to aid royal intimacy. Mainstream fact. In many medieval courts, music was not confined to banquets or processions. Certain melodies, especially gentle lute playing or psalm-like chants,
were thought to calm the mind and body. In fact, some chronicles mention minstrels hired specifically to play softly outside bedchamber doors, their notes weaving through stone corridors like whispered blessings. Picture it, a single harp plucked carefully, its strings echoing down the drafty hall. Or a recorder sighing through a lullaby-like tune while courtiers huddled nearby, gossiping in hushed tones. Inside the chamber, the king and queen might hear those faint sounds and take it as both entertainment and encouragement, though one suspects not everyone agreed that mood music was necessary. Quirky tidbit. A record from Burgundy describes a courtier who was instructed to sing love verses through a keyhole because the king believed his queen liked the sound of poetry more than music. Whether she actually appreciated serenades through the door is another matter entirely. Historians still argue whether such serenades were truly private acts of devotion or more ceremonial performances designed to emphasize the seriousness of royal unions. Was it romance, or was it politics wrapped in melody? The line is blurry. Joke 1. Imagine trying to concentrate while a court minstrel hums outside like medieval elevator music. But music wasn't the only sound used. Incantations, whispered prayers, even rhythmic chanting sometimes filled the chamber. Priests believed that sound carried spiritual weight, that a blessed tone could protect a couple from evil spirits lurking in the night. Bells, too, played a role. Tiny silver bells were rung at thresholds or tied to canopies, their chimes believed to ward off misfortune. Quirky tidbit again. In some places, animals were also part of the soundscape. Cats, considered lucky in certain regions, were deliberately allowed to curl up on cushions nearby, their purrs mingling with lute music. The result? A bizarre duet of strings and feline snores. Joke 2. Nothing says royal romance like being serenaded by both a harpist and a snoring cat. The music varied by region. In Italy, it leaned toward poetic verses. In France, soft dances slowed down to lull-like rhythms. In the Ottoman courts that influenced parts of Europe, musicians favored flutes and frame drums, creating hypnotic pulses that might echo through velvet curtains. Each tradition framed intimacy as a choreographed performance, supported by sound. Historians debate how much the kings themselves enjoyed these rituals. Some likely embraced the pageantry, while others might have groaned inwardly at having to endure another round of lute music before drifting into restless sleep. For queens, the experience may have ranged from soothing to simply irritating, depending on whether the harpist stayed in tune. Joke 3. Medieval queens probably invented the first eye roll when someone whispered, "Wait, let's add a bit more harp to set the mood." Still, the sound rituals mattered. They softened the austere silence of stone castles, wrapped the royal bed in atmosphere, and reassured everyone, attendants, courtiers, even the king himself, that this moment was sanctified and in some strange way orchestrated. So tonight, as you listen to the hum of your own room, imagine faint strains of harp, a hush of chanting, perhaps even the steady purr of a cat. It's odd, almost comical, yet deeply human. An attempt to make love and lineage feel a little less lonely, a little more magical.
The air is scented, the chamber hushed, and the harp outside plucks its final notes. But another ritual awaited, one far less musical and far more symbolic, the offering of special foods and drinks to kindle both appetite and intimacy. Mainstream fact: medieval courts placed enormous faith in aphrodisiacs. Physicians and apothecaries compiled long lists of foods thought to stir the blood: almonds, figs, ginger, honey, eggs, and above all, wine. Before retiring, a king might sip mulled wine laced with cinnamon, believing the spice would warm his humors and strengthen his vigor. Queens, too, were served small sweetmeats, their delicate sugar crusts imported from as far as Venice or Alexandria. Picture it, a silver platter carried in by a steward, piled with candied nuts and glistening dates. The fire pops in the hearth, shadows flicker on tapestries, and the king, already wrapped in embroidered linens, pops a fig into his mouth like it's a royal vitamin pill. Quirky tidbit. One chronicle describes an English king convinced that oysters were the key to vitality. He reportedly ordered barrels of them delivered daily, though historians dryly note that it may have had less to do with romance and more to do with his appetite for seafood. Historians still argue whether these aphrodisiacs were effective or mostly placebo. Some physicians swore by ginger and saffron, while others warned that too much wine could weaken the spirit. Was the king genuinely fortified, or simply tipsy and overconfident? Scholars debate. Joke 1. Let's be honest, more than one royal romance probably ended with, "Maybe I shouldn't have had that third oyster." The presentation of these foods was ritual in itself. Dishes were gilded, spices sprinkled like jewels. Honey was drizzled on almonds to symbolize sweetness in union. The servants presented them with a flourish, then withdrew, leaving the royal couple to nibble their magic snacks in candlelight. Quirky tidbit again. In parts of Iberia, saffron-laced rice pudding was sometimes prepared for queens, not just for its fertility associations, but because it glowed like gold in the firelight. A bowl of glowing pudding hardly seems romantic today, but to a medieval court, it was radiant symbolism. Joke 2. Nothing sets the mood quite like staring into a golden bowl of rice pudding while your spouse insists it's working. And then there were the drinks. Spiced wines, cordials brewed with herbs, even concoctions of egg yolk and honey were poured into jeweled goblets. One especially odd recipe included ground stag antler, believed to transfer the animal's vigor. Whether anyone actually enjoyed sipping powdered antler in wine is doubtful, but kings were not ones to dismiss tradition. Historians debate whether queens welcomed these foods or merely endured them. Some may have found the spiced wine soothing. Others might have gritted their teeth while chewing an oddly seasoned almond meant to spark passion. Joke 3. Imagine being served a goblet and asking, "What's in this?" only to hear, "Oh, just some antler. Drink up." And so, in the royal chamber, food and intimacy were intertwined. Every bite was heavy with symbolism: fertility, sweetness, strength, dynasty. To us, it looks quirky, even absurd. But to medieval kings, these dishes weren't just snacks. They were talismans of power and progeny, each almond and fig a small pledge that the royal line would continue. As you close your eyes tonight, think of the flickering fire, the hush of a distant harp, and a king balancing a sticky honey cake in one hand while trying to look regal. Strange rituals indeed, yet deeply human. Even kings, for all their power, believed in the magic of midnight snacks.
The robes are tied, the perfumes linger, and the attendants step back with practiced bows. But before the king and queen settled beneath embroidered sheets, another ritual was performed, one that seems almost theatrical to us today. This was the blessing of the bed itself, a curious ceremony mixing faith, superstition, and stagecraft. Mainstream fact: royal beds were not ordinary furniture. They were monumental objects, carved of oak or walnut, draped in silks, and often considered symbols of dynastic continuity. In some courts, priests or chaplains were called to sprinkle holy water over the mattress and curtains before the royal couple entered. A prayer might be chanted, asking for fertility, protection, and peaceful rest. To lie in the king's bed was, in a sense, to lie in a consecrated space. Picture it, the bed, tall as a dais, curtained in crimson or saffron, its canopy painted with golden stars. A priest steps forward with a brass aspergillum, flicking droplets of water that sparkle in candlelight. The smell of incense hangs heavy, curling toward the rafters. For a moment, the chamber feels like a chapel, half sacred and half absurd. Quirky tidbit. In France, it was sometimes customary to place a loaf of bread beneath the bed as a charm against infertility. One wonders whether the royal mice saw this as a nightly feast. Historians still argue whether these bed blessings were primarily religious acts or theatrical displays for attendants and courtiers. Was the purpose truly divine intervention, or was it another way of reminding everyone that even in the bedroom, the monarchy was ordained by heaven? Joke 1. Imagine trying to drift off, knowing there's a stale loaf of bread hiding under your mattress. The bed itself carried layers of symbolism. In Burgundy, bedposts were carved with vine motifs, symbolizing fruitfulness. In Aragon, canopies were embroidered with hunting scenes, perhaps suggesting vigor. A bed was never just a bed. It was a stage where lineage was supposed to be written. Quirky tidbit, again. In some English courts, it was considered unlucky if the royal bed's canopy curtains were not tied in a precise order, right first, then left, then center. Attendants fumbled nervously, knowing that a misplaced knot could mean whispered accusations of sabotaging fertility. Joke 3. It's the medieval version of "Did you turn the pillow the right way?" but with dynastic consequences. And then there were the charms. Amulets tucked under pillows, sprigs of rosemary tied discreetly near the headboard, even little bronze figurines hidden in corners, all meant to ensure safety from nightmares, misfortune, or meddling spirits. Historians debate whether kings truly believed in such charms or tolerated them as traditions of their households. Queens, however, sometimes kept personal tokens, lockets, relics, or rings by the bedside, offering a touch of private comfort amidst all the ritual. Joke 3. Imagine telling a medieval queen she couldn't bring her lucky charm to bed. You'd likely be sleeping in the stables instead. So, as the bed creaked beneath its canopy, layered with blessings, bread loaves, charms, and whispered prayers, it became more than a place of rest. It was a theater of hopes, anxieties, and symbols, a nightly reminder that even in their most private hours, kings and queens lived on display. As you drift tonight, picture yourself lying beneath a canopy sprinkled with holy water, guarded by rosemary sprigs, and a loaf of bread tucked somewhere beneath. Peculiar? Absolutely. But to a medieval monarch, these rituals made the difference between restless sleep and divine assurance.
The bed has been blessed, the bread is tucked away beneath the frame, and the canopy curtains are tied in just the right order. Yet still, the rituals of intimacy in a medieval king's chamber were not over. Now we arrive at a practice both curious and awkward to modern ears, the requirement of witnesses and attendants during private moments. Mainstream fact: in many European courts, royal unions were not considered fully valid unless they were in some way observed. Sometimes this meant literal witnesses in the room, discreet attendants, clerics, or high-ranking courtiers who remained until the couple was settled beneath the covers. In other cases, it meant an official escort to the chamber, with the procession itself serving as proof. The reasoning was dynastic. Heirs mattered too much to leave any doubt. Picture it: a cluster of solemn courtiers in russet and indigo robes, standing awkwardly near the door as the king and queen climb into a bed the size of a small stage. Tapestries glow in the firelight. The courtiers clear their throats, pretend to admire the embroidery, and wait until the right moment to slip away.
Privacy, as we understand it, was often a luxury even monarchs did not enjoy. Quirky tidbit. In certain French courts, a symbolic gesture sufficed. A servant might remove one boot from the king's foot as he sat on the bed, then depart, leaving the rest to imagination. That single shoe was considered legal proof that intimacy had commenced. Historians still argue whether these rituals were enforced strictly or often ignored in practice. Some suggest that official witnesses were present only at first marriages or especially political unions. Others maintain it was routine, an uncomfortable reminder that the body of a monarch belonged to the realm as much as to themselves. Joke 1. Imagine being the unlucky courtier whose entire job description boiled down to professional bed witness. The presence of attendants also created a strange choreography. Some stood in corners pretending to pray, others busied themselves with candles, while a chosen few recorded the event in chronicles. Not the act itself, of course, but the symbolic completion of the ritual. The king and queen were joined this night in holy union. A single line in a dusty ledger, yet centuries later, it's all historians have to reconstruct what must have been a supremely awkward scene. Quirky tidbit again. In Castile, there are records of entire choirs following a royal couple to the door, singing until the bed curtains were drawn. Whether the newlyweds found that uplifting or unbearable is anyone's guess. Joke 2. Nothing sets the mood quite like 20 monks harmonizing outside your door while you try to get comfortable. The tradition could vary with politics. In times of dynastic tension, witnesses were stricter, as if the entire realm wanted proof of heirs in progress. In calmer times, the rituals relaxed, and the couple may have enjoyed more genuine privacy. Yet the idea persisted across centuries. A king's bed was not entirely his own. Historians debate whether queens dreaded this more than kings. For some queens, the ritual stripped away dignity. For others, it confirmed their elevated role, with their very presence considered proof of alliance and continuity. Joke 3. Somewhere in the annals of history, there's probably a courtier's diary entry that just reads, "Stood awkwardly at bedside. 2/10. Would not recommend." So, as you drift tonight, imagine the strangeness of falling asleep with courtiers shuffling at the door, a missing boot as your legal contract, and perhaps a choir humming away in the corridor. Peculiar though it seems, these rituals remind us that for medieval kings, intimacy was never simply personal. It was a performance, witnessed, recorded, and folded into the machinery of dynasty.
The courtiers shuffle out at last, the candles sputter low, and the choir fades into silence in the corridor. One might imagine the king finally enjoying some privacy, but no, another layer of ritual awaited. This was the custom of symbolic gifts exchanged between king and queen within the bedchamber, tokens meant to affirm union, loyalty, or even fertility. Mainstream fact: gift-giving was central to medieval diplomacy, and the royal bed was no exception. Kings and queens often exchanged rings, brooches, prayer books, or reliquaries on the night of marriage or during special feasts. These items were not mere trinkets, but objects saturated with meaning. A saint's relic, a jewel shaped like a dove, or a miniature psalter inscribed with blessings. They served as visible promises, tokens of fidelity that transcended words. Picture the scene. The king, reclining against carved pillows, produces a small gilded box. Within lies a jeweled cross said to hold a splinter of holy wood. The queen accepts it with bowed head,
then offers in return a silken pouch embroidered with her family crest, containing perhaps a lock of hair or a charm from her homeland. Their hands linger as the objects pass between them, the gifts glowing in candlelight like miniature stars. Quirky tidbit. In Aragon, one record mentions a queen who presented her king with a tiny trained falcon as a bedchamber gift. Whether the bird was allowed to stay the night is blissfully unclear, but one hopes it wasn't perched at the bed's edge. Historians still argue whether these tokens were exchanged in earnest or largely ceremonial. Were they heartfelt gestures of affection or carefully choreographed moves in the chessboard of dynastic politics? The truth is probably both, a blend of genuine emotion and cold symbolism wrapped in silken ribbons. Joke 1. Picture unwrapping your spouse's gift only to find it's another reliquary. Oh great, just what I needed, a third saint's finger bone. Some queens favored textiles as offerings, hand-woven girdles, scented handkerchiefs, or ribbons soaked in rose water. Kings leaned toward jewels, coins, or relics. Both types carried meaning: fabric for binding, metal for permanence, relics for divine blessing. Quirky tidbit again. A French king once received a jewel carved into the shape of a pomegranate from his bride, symbolizing fertility. Chroniclers noted he kept it at his bedside until his death. A curious mixture of romance and superstition. Joke 3. Imagine modern couples reviving the tradition. Here's a toothbrush with our family crest. Cherish it forever. So, as you close your eyes tonight, imagine the flicker of gold, the rustle of silk, and the strange tenderness of exchanging gifts in the quietest of spaces. For medieval kings and queens, these tokens were more than keepsakes. They were talismans, reminders that even in intimacy, their lives belonged to history as much as to themselves.
The jeweled brooch is tucked safely into a silk pouch, the lock of hair tied with ribbon placed reverently on the table. The courtiers have gone, the choir has quieted, and the air is heavy with incense and the faint sweetness of rose water. Yet even then, the rituals were not done. For some medieval kings, dream interpretation became the final, peculiar act of the night. Mainstream fact: dreams carried enormous weight in medieval thought. Rooted in classical texts like Aristotle and expanded by Christian theologians, dreams were believed to be messages from God, signs of future fortune, or warnings against unseen dangers. For a king, whose fate was bound up with that of an entire kingdom, dreams weren't private nonsense. They were state business. It was not uncommon for a chaplain, physician, or even a professional dream interpreter to be summoned to hear about the king's night visions the very next morning. Picture the scene. The king lies beneath a canopy, stitched with gold stars, drifting into sleep. In his dream, a falcon swoops across a battlefield, or a serpent coils around a scepter. At dawn, servants hurry in with parchment and quills to record the vision, as if the night itself had dictated royal policy. One English chronicle reports that a king dreamed of a giant boar chasing him through the palace halls. The royal interpreter solemnly announced it foretold a rebellion. Personally, one might suspect it had more to do with the heavy venison stew from dinner. Historians still argue whether kings genuinely believed these dream prophecies or simply used them as convenient justification for decisions already forming. Was the dream shaping reality, or was reality shaping the dream after the fact? In any case, scribes dutifully noted them, adding another strange thread to the tapestry of court ritual. Joke 1.
Imagine your boss showing up to work and announcing, "I dreamt of a goose, so we're invading Normandy." Sometimes queens had their own role in these rituals. They were expected to share dreams that might relate to fertility or the birth of heirs. A dream of fruit-laden trees or flowing rivers was taken as a hopeful omen, while barren fields or broken vessels caused worry. Queens, like kings, carried their nocturnal visions into the political realm. Quirky tidbit again. In some Italian courts, interpreters consulted special dream books, vast compilations listing symbols and their supposed meanings. One such book declared that dreaming of cats signified treachery, while dreaming of cheese meant incoming wealth. By that logic, a king dreaming of a cat stealing cheese might have had a very confusing morning. Joke 2. Medieval dream books were basically the 14th century version of those astrology apps on your phone. Not all kings welcomed the practice. Some privately mocked the idea, but others clung to it with fervor. For them, dreams were a rare space where divine forces whispered directly. Even if muddled, they carried a kind of authority no courtier could argue against. Historians debate how much political weight was truly given to these interpretations. Did a king launch campaigns based on dreams? Occasionally, yes, though more often, dreams reinforced choices already deemed prudent. Yet the ritual of listening, recording, and interpreting gave a strange solemnity to the most personal of experiences, sleep itself. Joke 3. It's rather poetic, isn't it? The fate of kingdoms swayed not just by swords or treaties, but by whether the king dreamed of a piglet or a pear. So, as you rest tonight, imagine a chamber perfumed with incense, a canopy dripping with embroidery, and a monarch drifting into dreams that will be dissected by half a dozen clerics before breakfast. Peculiar as it sounds, this was part of the nightly pageant, sleep transformed into prophecy, and private visions reshaped into matters of state. The dreams have been spoken, scribes have inked their records, and the queen has whispered her own visions of rivers and orchards. But before the day truly began, there was one more peculiar ritual that touched the private world of medieval kings: the consumption of supposed aphrodisiac foods and potions, often presented in the quiet of the chamber. Mainstream fact: medieval medicine was rooted in humoral theory, the belief that health and temperament arose from balancing four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Certain foods were thought to stir desire by heating the body, while others cooled it dangerously. Almonds, figs, honey, ginger, and eggs were common favorites, prescribed by physicians and reinforced by tradition. Picture it: a wooden tray carried in by a sleepy servant at dawn, bearing bowls of stewed apples glazed with cinnamon, cups of spiced wine, and honey-drizzled wafers. The king, still wrapped in linen sheets, reaches for a fig, believing it will summon vigor and perhaps divine favor for the day's obligations. The queen might nibble almonds, while attendants wait discreetly in the background. Quirky tidbit: in some courts, powdered rhinoceros horn was considered the ultimate stimulant, despite the fact that most rhinoceros horn was likely just ground-up deer antler. One wonders whether kings noticed the difference. Historians still argue whether these rituals were taken seriously as medicine or whether they were symbolic acts meant to reassure everyone that the king's virility was being actively cultivated. After all, a royal appetite for almonds and wine was easy to display, but its true effectiveness is anyone's guess. Joke 1. Imagine convincing your personal physician
that the only cure for your fatigue is, conveniently, another goblet of mulled wine. Some foods were thought to influence fertility itself. Walnuts, shaped like tiny brains, were associated with strengthening the mind and, by extension, male potency. Pomegranates symbolized abundance, their red seeds linked with blood and vitality. Honey was almost universally praised, sweet and golden, a perfect metaphor for passion. Quirky tidbit again. In Germany, some records mention kings being served roasted parsnips as a bedroom dish, considered a stirring root. Modern diners may find it less than romantic. Joke 2. Nothing sets the mood quite like a lukewarm parsnip at sunrise. These food rituals blurred the line between medicine, superstition, and indulgence. Was the king truly following a physician's orders, or was he simply enjoying another platter of sugared almonds under the guise of duty to the realm? Historians debate whether queens embraced these rituals or rolled their eyes at the parade of exotic dishes. For some, it may have been reassuring. For others, it was yet another reminder that their bodies were seen as dynastic instruments rather than personal selves. Joke 3. Somewhere, surely, a medieval queen whispered, "If I see one more plate of figs, I'm moving back to my father's castle." And so, with trays of honey, spices, and peculiar roots, the morning began not just with prayers, but with flavors believed to shape destiny. For medieval kings, the bedroom was a pharmacy, a chapel, and a stage all in one. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine the mingled scent of ginger, honey, and wine drifting through heavy curtains, the soft crunch of almonds, and the hope, however misplaced, that such foods held the secret to vigor, fertility, and dynastic security. The trays of figs and honey are cleared away, the air still heavy with the sweetness of cinnamon and clove. Yet in many courts, the king's private mourning was not complete until another ritual took place, the consultation of relics and charms thought to guard or enhance marital intimacy. Mainstream fact: relics were everywhere in medieval life, from cathedral altars to battlefield standards. It was not unusual for a king to keep a small reliquary in his chamber, a saint's tooth, a fragment of cloth, even a sliver of bone, believed to bestow protection, health, or fertility. The presence of such objects at the royal bedside lent a sacred aura to even the most private acts. Picture it: a polished wooden reliquary set on a carved stool, its lid studded with gems. The king kneels before it in the linen shift, murmuring prayers that the saint intercede for strong heirs. The queen may touch the reliquary too, laying her hands over the carved silver, seeking divine blessing for her womb. The act is quiet, solemn, and curiously intimate, a mingling of fleshly hopes with spiritual faith. Quirky tidbit: in one Burgundian court, a king was said to keep a tiny phial of earth from the Holy Land beneath his pillow, believing it gave vigor in bed. Whether this improved anything beyond his sense of piety is anyone's guess. Historians still argue whether these relic rituals were primarily about sincere devotion or about staging piety for the benefit of attendants and record keepers. Did kings truly believe a saint's toenail made them more potent, or was it a way to signal divine sanction over their unions? Both readings have their defenders. Joke 1. Imagine explaining to your friends, no, I swear, this isn't weird. It's St. Cuthbert's sandal strap. Works every time. Beyond relics, charms and amulets also played a role. Herbal sachets tied with red thread, tiny wax figures, or copper coins stamped with prayers were slipped beneath mattresses or sewn into bed hangings. Some were gifts from queens, others from physicians, and still others from local wise women whose influence quietly reached the palace. Quirky tidbit again. A charm from late medieval France instructed that a husband and wife should each eat half of a roasted apple inscribed with psalms, believing it would bind their affections. Whether this was romantic or simply sticky, we may never know. Joke 2. Nothing says love like whispering, "Darling, did you eat your half of the sacred apple yet?" These charms reveal how blurred the boundaries were between religion, medicine, and magic. The church frowned on many of them, yet kings kept them anyway, hedging their bets. After all, when dynastic survival rested on heirs, no talisman felt too small to try. Historians still argue whether these relic rituals were primarily about sincere devotion or about staging piety for the benefit of attendants and record keepers. Did kings truly believe a saint's toenail made them more potent, or was it a way to signal divine sanction over their unions? Both readings have their defenders. You almost feel sorry for the royal laundress, tasked with washing pillowcases stuffed with dried herbs and bits of parchment. So this, as you drift tonight, picture that bed not only as a place of rest, but also as a reliquary itself, hung with charms, lined with relics, perfumed with herbs. Peculiar though it seems, these objects made kings feel shielded, sanctified, and perhaps just a little more confident about the uncertain night ahead.
The reliquaries are kissed, the charms arranged beneath pillows, and the chamber smells faintly of dried rosemary and beeswax. Yet for medieval kings, privacy was a fragile luxury. Even in the most intimate settings, rituals of witness and record crept into the bedchamber. Mainstream fact. In many royal marriages, consummation was not considered valid unless it was witnessed, or at least vouched for, by trusted attendants. This could mean courtiers waiting just outside the chamber door, or in some notorious cases, present within the room itself until the curtains were drawn. The logic was simple. Heirs were too important to leave to rumor. There had to be proof that king and queen had fulfilled their dynastic duty. Picture it. The royal couple climbs into bed beneath a canopy embroidered with golden vines. A cluster of courtiers hover at a respectful distance, adjusting candles, murmuring prayers, shuffling awkwardly as if waiting for a play to begin. Finally, the steward of the household clears his throat, bows, and announces that the duty of union has commenced. Only then do the curtains close. Quirky tidbit. In some French courts, an official would even bless the bed before the act, sprinkling holy water on the sheets. One can imagine the damp discomfort that followed. Historians still argue whether these practices were widespread or limited to a few highly ceremonial unions. Did every royal marriage require such awkward formalities, or only those involving dynastically crucial alliances? Records are patchy, and scholars continue to debate how often the line between privacy and politics was crossed. Joke 1. Nothing says romance like a group of courtiers whispering outside your bed curtains, quills poised to take notes. Sometimes the presence of witnesses was symbolic rather than literal. Servants might escort the couple to the chamber, bow, and remain at the threshold until ordered away. Even so, the symbolism carried weight. The king's intimacy was never truly his own. Quirky tidbit again. In one Burgundian wedding, the couple was ceremonially tucked into bed by half the mobility of the region, all while music played. Imagine the pressure to look suitably affectionate under so many watchful eyes. Joke 2.
It's hard to relax when your cousin the Duke is adjusting your blankets. These rituals, however bizarre to modern eyes, reflected the deep anxiety surrounding heirs. Without children, dynasties faltered, wars of succession erupted, and kingdoms fell into chaos. Thus, the most personal acts became state business, overseen by protocols as rigid as any coronation. Historians debate whether kings themselves minded. Some may have resented the intrusion, others likely accepted it as part of their role. For a medieval monarch, there was little separation between body and crown. Even in bed, he was performing kingship. Joke 3. You almost pity the chroniclers forced to record the dry phrase "marriage consummated" when they probably just wanted to go home and sleep. So, as you drift tonight, picture a royal bed not only as a place of velvet and down, but as a stage, curtains drawn, actors waiting, and history itself straining to listen at the keyhole. Peculiar, yes, but for medieval kings, intimacy was yet another performance in the endless theater of monarchy. The courtiers shuffle away at last, the curtains pulled closed, the candles dimmed. Yet for many medieval kings there was still one more odd layer to the rituals of intimacy: the involvement of physicians, astrologers, and sometimes even alchemists who prescribed the right time for closeness. Mainstream fact: medieval medicine and astrology were inseparably linked. Learned physicians believed that the stars, planets, and phases of the moon influenced not only health, but fertility. Kings often consulted experts to determine the most auspicious night for conception, ensuring that cosmic forces favored the birth of heirs. Picture it: a royal physician, wrapped in a russet cloak, standing by the chamber fire with a parchment chart of the heavens. He points out that Jupiter is in a favorable house, while Venus shines brightly, signaling that this very night is ideal. The king nods gravely, as though negotiating a treaty, while the queen suppresses a sigh at yet another intrusion of politics into her personal life. A quirky tidbit: in one English court, an astrologer claimed that a child conceived on a Tuesday under Mars's influence would grow up to be quarrelsome. One imagines couples carefully rescheduling their evenings around such warnings. Historians still argue how literally these instructions were followed. Did kings obey the celestial charts, or did they nod politely and proceed as they wished? Surviving correspondence shows both extremes. Some rulers obsessed over auspicious timings, while others dismissed astrologers as stargazers, peddling nonsense. Joke 1. Imagine your doctor telling you, "I'm afraid Venus is in the wrong quadrant. Better wait until Thursday." Beyond timing, physicians also suggested postures, diets, and even prayers to increase chances of male heirs. Instructions ranged from the vaguely medical, like avoid cold foods before bed, to the bizarre, like tying a rooster's feather around the waist for vigor. Quirky tidbit again: some astrologers claimed that conceiving under a full moon increased the likelihood of sons. Given the frequency of full moons, one wonders whether kings simply seized the excuse for regular attempts. Joke 2. It's probably the only time in history when the line, "Sorry dear, Mercury is retrograde," was taken seriously. The queen's role was also subject to these dictates. She might be instructed to pray to a specific saint beforehand, or to wear a particular gemstone, such as a ruby, believed to enhance fertility. In effect, even her body became part of a larger alchemical experiment.
Historians debate whether such practices gave comfort or added pressure. For some couples, the rituals may have provided a sense of control in an uncertain process. For others, it may have been another reminder that their union was not truly their own, but managed by doctors, clerics, and stars. Joke 3. You almost feel bad for the poor astrologer, blamed if the royal nursery stayed empty, as though Saturn personally conspired against him. So, as you ease into slumber tonight, imagine the royal chamber not only as a sanctuary, but also as an observatory, where the soft flicker of candles meets the vast sweep of the cosmos, and where even the stars themselves were thought to have a say in the future of kingdoms.
The astrologer has folded his parchment, the physicians have retreated, and the chamber hushes once again. Yet before sleep settles, another peculiar practice sometimes colored the private world of medieval kings: the use of veils, masks, or playful disguises within the royal bedchamber. Mainstream fact: courtly culture in the Middle Ages often blurred the lines between performance and reality. Masquerades, mummings, and festivals introduced an element of theater into noble life, and occasionally these habits crept into royal bedrooms. Symbolic costumes or veils were used not only in public celebrations, but also in private rituals meant to heighten intimacy, mystery, or amusement. Picture it. A queen enters the bedchamber wearing a delicate silk veil dyed saffron, embroidered with tiny gold stars. She might remove it with a flourish, as though unveiling herself before the king like a stage actress. In some cases, masks, often simple cloth with painted features, were worn, transforming the royal couple into characters from allegory or romance. Quirky tidbit: in certain Italian courts, it was said that queens would appear at feasts disguised as mythical goddesses, and some whispered these games extended into more private spaces afterward. Whether playful or symbolic, such disguises reflected the medieval delight in role play and spectacle. Historians still argue whether these veiling customs in bed were common practice or merely exaggerated courtly rumor. Chronicles record snippets, but often in tones of scandal, leaving us to wonder what was real ritual and what was juicy gossip. Joke 1. Imagine trying to maintain dignity as King of England while your wife surprises you wearing a papier-mâché falcon mask. Veils could also symbolize purity, fertility, or transition. Some queens kept a ritual veil only for wedding nights or feast days, removing it slowly before joining their husbands. Others might borrow garments from festival pageants, blurring the line between sacred ceremony and playful intimacy. Quirky tidbit again. In Burgundian records, one lord reportedly gifted his queen a wimple studded with tiny bells so that every movement jingled softly. One hopes it did not disturb the neighbors. Joke 2. Nothing says royal romance quite like jingling softly every time you turn your head. These performances carried cultural weight. Medieval kings and queens lived surrounded by pageantry. Even in their most private spaces, echoes of theater followed. A mask or veil could shift the mood, transform the familiar into something novel, and remind both king and queen that their roles were both personal and political. Historians debate whether queens used veils and masks to assert control, turning the chamber into their stage, or whether these rituals were simply tolerated amusements for kings accustomed to spectacle. Either way, the symbolism mattered, even if only to the participants. Joke 3. One can almost picture the laundress sighing at yet another stained silk veil, muttering, "Pageantry doesn't wash out easily." So, as you drift tonight, imagine a dimly lit chamber where heavy curtains close out the world and where the royal couple, crowned by duty and shadowed by politics, indulges in one more small rebellion, slipping on a veil or mask, and for a fleeting moment, becoming someone else entirely.
The jingle of tiny bills fades. The silk veil is folded away, and yet another curious ritual rises to the surface. The blessings sought from saints and holy intercessors, often woven directly into the royal couple's most private moments. Mainstream fact: medieval kings and queens viewed their intimacy not as a purely private act, but as a dynastic duty under God's watchful eye. It was common for them to appeal to saints for fertility, protection, or divine favor. Shrines dedicated to figures like Saint Anne or Saint Margaret were visited specifically to pray for children, and relics were sometimes carried back to chambers. Picture it: a royal procession arriving at a cathedral, the queen kneeling before a gilded reliquary, her hands clasped tightly, while whispering prayers for a healthy son. Later that evening, in the privacy of the chamber, a tiny relic, perhaps a scrap of cloth said to belong to the Virgin, is set upon the bedside table, a silent witness to the night's hopes. Quirky tidbit: some couples would fast or abstain on certain days only to seek a saint's blessing before resuming conjugal life, believing the sacrifice strengthened divine favor. In Spain, there are even records of monarchs gifting entire golden chalices to churches as thanks for pregnancies thought to be aided by saintly intervention. Historians still argue how sincere or symbolic these gestures were. Did the saints' blessings truly reassure the royal couple, or were they public theater meant to remind subjects that heirs were divinely ordained? The line between private devotion and political messaging was often razor thin. Joke 1. Imagine telling your confessor, "Father, we did everything right, except we forgot to check St. Margaret's calendar." Blessings weren't always solemn. Sometimes they were embedded in festivals or pilgrimages that doubled as romantic retreats. A king might ride with his queen to a rural chapel, the journey itself turning into a symbolic getaway from the pressing eyes of court. Quirky tidbit again: in certain regions, it was believed that sleeping beneath the cloak of a saint statue, or even tucking a tiny wax figurine under one's pillow, could improve chances of conception. Whether symbolic or superstitious, the practice shows how even the royal bed was shaped by faith. Joke 2. One wonders how many wax figurines ended up melted accidentally near a candle, leaving puzzled chambermaids to scrape residue off the sheets. The rituals of blessing also reflected a broader medieval worldview, that all things physical and spiritual intertwined. Kings were not just rulers of bodies and lands, but also caretakers of souls, including their own household. By invoking saints, they wrapped their most intimate acts in a cloak of legitimacy, humility, and hope. Historians debate whether queens embraced this pious framing or felt constrained by it. Some may have drawn comfort from saintly protection. Others may have sighed at yet another ceremonial intrusion into what little privacy they had. Joke 3. Picture a royal whispering, "Darling, let's not disturb the relic. It's staring at us." So, as you settle deeper into the quiet tonight, imagine the soft glow of candles illuminating relics on a bedside table, prayers murmured like lullabies, and the invisible presence of saints hovering gently over the chamber, blending faith and flesh in a peculiarly medieval harmony.
The relics glimmer faintly in the candlelight, prayers whispered, incense fading into the rafters. Yet even with saints invoked and charms placed, another layer of ritual surrounded the royal bed. The physical tokens of fertility and union, gifts, symbols, and curious objects exchanged between king and queen. Mainstream fact: Gift-giving was central to medieval court life, and within the bedchamber, it often took on symbolic forms. Kings might present queens with jewels shaped like fruit or flowers, emblems of fertility and abundance. Queens, in turn, might gift their husbands rings, belts, or embroidered tokens said to carry blessings for virility. Picture it: a jeweled pomegranate brooch, crimson enamel glistening in lamplight, handed solemnly from king to queen as both a love token and a dynastic promise. Or a golden girdle clasp inscribed with prayers fastened around the queen's waist before she retired for the night. These weren't just ornaments. They were charged with hopes of heirs and marital stability. Quirky tidbit: in some German courts, it was fashionable to gift eggs painted with protective charms during spring festivals, believed to increase fertility. Imagine slipping a brightly painted egg into your spouse's palm before heading to bed. Historians still argue whether these exchanges were purely personal gestures or carefully staged rituals witnessed by attendants. Some sources describe intimate gift ceremonies performed in private, while others suggest they were semi-public events, reinforcing the sacred bond of royal marriage. Joke 1. Nothing says romance like handing your partner a gilded egg and hoping it works. Sometimes these tokens were worn discreetly. Queens might stitch protective charms into night clothes, while kings might wear rings engraved with astrological signs favorable to passion. One chronicle even mentions a king refusing to remove his lucky belt during intimacy, insisting it ensured divine blessing. Quirky tidbit again. In Venice, a rumor circulated that a duke gifted his wife a necklace strung with carved amber figurines, each said to hold magical properties. Whether charming or awkward, such jewelry blurred the line between devotion and superstition. Joke 2. One imagines the queen muttering, "Thank you, dear, but maybe next time just flowers?" These exchanges reveal how deeply objects mediated royal relationships. The gifts were not simply pretty trinkets, but talismans, binding oaths, and dynastic tools wrapped in glittering settings. They reassured anxious couples that their union was reinforced by symbols both earthly and divine. Historians debate whether queens used such gifts to negotiate subtle power by accepting, rejecting, or repurposing them, or whether they were simply passive participants in a ritual scripted by kings and courtiers. Each jeweled clasp and embroidered girdle carried layers of meaning far beyond its sparkle. Joke 3. You almost feel bad for the royal jeweler, tasked with creating items that doubled as both fashion and fertility aids. So, as you sink deeper into drowsiness, imagine a royal chamber where intimacy glitters with enamel, gems, and embroidery, where love is measured not only in whispers and touch, but also in gilded tokens passed hand to hand, each carrying the peculiar weight of dynastic hope.
The jeweled pomegranate gleams, the embroidered girdle rests on silken sheets, and the chamber falls once more into its hushed rhythm. Yet for medieval kings, even at the final layer of ritual, there lingered one more peculiar practice: the careful recording of intimacy as dynastic evidence. Mainstream fact: royal households often kept detailed records, from finances to feasts. But in some courts, chroniclers and clerks also documented milestones of marriage, including when and how intimacy was performed. These were not salacious details, but dry, formulaic notes, meant to safeguard against disputes over legitimacy. A line like, "The union was honored and witnessed," could carry the weight of dynastic proof for centuries. Picture it: a weary scribe, quill in hand, seated in a corner chamber the morning after, recording in neat brown ink. On this night, the king and queen shared the bed in harmony. No flourish, no scandal, just an entry in the ledger tucked between notes on grain deliveries and hawk feedings. Quirky tidbit: in certain Spanish archives, records survive where officials marked little stars in margins beside consummation notes, as though awarding the royal couple gold stars for effort. Historians still argue how invasive this practice truly was.
Were such records common or limited to particularly tense dynasties? Did the clerks ever exaggerate or omit details under pressure? With few surviving examples, the scholarly debate continues. Joke 1. Imagine your most private moment reduced to a line in an account book, right under 2 barrels of salted herring. The ritual of record-keeping highlights a recurring truth. Medieval kings never fully owned their private lives. Even passion and affection were folded into the machinery of state, transcribed and archived like so many treaties. The bed was not only a space for intimacy, but a battlefield of legitimacy. Ink and parchment replacing sword and shield. Quirky tidbit: some dramatic chroniclers claimed kings would send coded tokens, a flower, a ring, to trusted scribes as a discreet signal that the deed was done, sparing them the embarrassment of formal testimony. Joke 2. Nothing says romance like dispatching a messenger at dawn with the message, "Mission accomplished." For the queens, too, these records carried heavy implications. Their names, reputations, and futures were bound to a line of text in a dusty ledger. A simple entry could affirm their honor, or, if absent, fuel whispers and plots. Historians debate whether kings ever resisted this intrusion, or whether they accepted it as another brick in the fortress of monarchy. Some may have shrugged at the quills scratching outside their door. Others may have quietly fumed that their most private duty was reduced to bureaucratic shorthand. Joke 3. You almost wish one scribe had scribbled, "Frankly, Your Majesty, I'd rather not know." And so the rituals conclude. From relics to veils, from astrologers to scribes, the peculiar private world of medieval kings emerges not as romance alone, but as duty dressed in pageantry, faith, and parchment. Now, let the pace soften, the words stretch, and the story dissolve into quiet.